The church smelled like old wood, lilies, and somebody's too sweet perfume. I stood near the front because that's where the immediate family is supposed to stand, even when your legs feel like they don't belong to you. People kept leaning in to tell me how at peace my father looked, even though the casket was closed. Their words landed like tiny pebbles, small, constant, and somehow heavy. My sister, Claire, played the perfect grieving daughter. She dabbed her eyes at the right moments, squeezed my hand when someone important walked by, and whispered, "You're doing so good, honey," like I was a kid at my own recital. My brother, Mark, stayed a step behind her, jaw tight, scanning the room like he was counting exits instead of blessings. Every few minutes, one of my aunts would pull me into a hug and say, "Don't worry about anything, sweetheart. We'll handle the hard stuff." They all said it the same way. Soft voice, practiced face. Between the hymns and the murmured prayers, I kept catching these little pauses in conversation, like a record scratch you don't hear, but you feel. When I walked toward the back to get some water, two cousins stopped talking mid-sentence. When I came back, they smiled too fast. Even the pastor's voice sounded careful, like he'd been briefed on what not to mention. I tried to blame it on grief, on nerves, on the weird social rules around death. But a part of me wouldn't let it go. My father had never been simple. He wasn't the warm, predictable man people described at the lectern. At home, he could be charming and distant in the same hour. He'd bring takeout from the little Italian place downtown and laugh with me over dumb reality shows, then disappear into his study like it was a locked shed in the backyard. Sometimes I'd hear him on the phone late at night, voice low and sharp, like he was bargaining with somebody who didn't take "no" as an answer. If I asked, he'd kiss my forehead and say, "Grown-up stuff, kiddo," even though I was old enough to vote and pay rent. When the service ended, everyone spilled into the parking lot like a crowd after a game. The sky was gray, the kind of winter afternoon that makes everything look a little flatter. People hugged, promised to call, promised to bring food. Then they clustered in groups, family here, friends there, like invisible ropes were pulling them into teams. Claire kept me close, but not in a sisterly way. More like she was steering me. At the graveside, my Uncle Richard stepped forward to say a few words. He talked about my father's generosity, his work ethic, how he'd always provide. I almost laughed, and the thought scared me because it wasn't funny. It was the kind of laugh you get when something is so wrong you don't know where to put it. Mark stared at the ground. Claire stared at the crowd. No one stared at the casket. Afterward, when we gathered at my father's house, the mood shifted again. It was still sad, but sharper around the edges. People moved through the rooms like they were checking inventory, the dining table, the cabinets, the framed photos. I stood in the hallway listening to the hum of voices and the clink of cups, and I realized I didn't hear anyone asking, "How are you?" anymore. Now it was, "What happens next?" I ended up in the kitchen because it was the only place nobody was performing. I rinsed a mug that didn't need rinsing and watched my reflection in the dark window. My face looked older than it had that morning. Behind me, I heard my aunt whisper, "She's the youngest," and someone answered, "Exactly." I turned, but they'd already moved on, their voices fading into the living room like smoke. Later, when everyone finally left, I sat alone on the bottom step of the staircase, still in my black dress, shoes kicked off. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for you to say something first. I looked toward the study door, the one my father always kept closed, and I felt that strange certainty settle deeper. He hadn't just left grief behind. He'd left a mess. And the people who were supposed to mourn him were already figuring out who would be stuck cleaning it up. The next day, the house filled up again, but nobody brought casseroles this time. They brought folders. They brought laptops. They brought a kind of energy that made the living room feel like a meeting, not a home. Mark had his sleeves rolled up like he was about to fix a sink. Claire wore this neat sweater and tight ponytail, the one she used when she wanted to look serious. They took over the dining table, spreading mail across it in piles. Envelopes with bank logos. Certified letters. Things stamped final notice in angry red. I hovered near the doorway with a cup of coffee I didn't taste, watching them sort my father's life into categories. Nobody invited me in. Nobody said, "Hey, sit, we need to talk." It was more like I wasn't supposed to be there at all. At first I caught pieces, numbers and dates and phrases that didn't belong in the same sentence as a funeral. Past due. Default. Collateral. Then Mark said a name I didn't recognize and Claire immediately shushed him, like he'd cursed in front of a child. That was the moment I stepped closer, because I was done being treated like a child in the house I grew up in. "What is that?" I asked, pointing at a thick packet with tabs and handwritten notes in the margins. Claire didn't look up. "It's paperwork." "That's not an answer." Mark sighed, rubbed his forehead, and finally met my eyes. Dad had financial issues. Claire shot him a look, then turned to me with a smile that wasn't warm. "Sweetheart, we're handling it. You don't need to stress yourself out right now." I set my coffee down so I wouldn't spill it when my hand started shaking. "Try me." They exchanged one of those silent conversations again, the same kind I'd noticed at the funeral. Then Claire slid a letter across the table like she was sliding a bill at a restaurant. I read the top line and my stomach tightened. Amount due. The number underneath made my brain stall for a second, like it had to reboot to process it. "This can't be right," I said. Mark let out a short, humorless laugh. "It's right." More letters came out. More numbers. Not one bank. Several. Then a different kind of letterhead, no logo, just plain text and a phone number. Claire's voice dropped when she talked about those. "Private lenders," she said, like she was trying not to summon them. I'd heard the word loan shark before, mostly in movies and jokes. Hearing it in our dining room felt unreal. It made my father's late-night phone calls snap into focus. It made the locked study door feel less like privacy and more like panic. "So what happens now?" I asked, even though my chest already knew. Claire leaned back in her chair and finally looked at me like I was part of the conversation. "We have to settle it. There's no way around it." Mark tapped the edge of a folder. "The estate doesn't cover everything. A lot of assets are tied up, and some accounts are frozen until probate. It's complicated." Claire nodded like she'd practiced this speech in the mirror. "We just need someone to take temporary responsibility so we can negotiate." "Someone," I repeated, because the word felt slippery. Mark stared at the papers. Claire stared at me. It wasn't dramatic. There wasn't a villain speech or a slam of the hand on the table. It was quieter than that, and somehow that made it worse. Claire started listing reasons like she was building a case. I didn't have kids. I didn't have a mortgage. I was flexible. I was not as financially tangled as they were. She said it like those were compliments. "You want me to sign for his debt," I said. "It's not like that," Claire replied too quickly. "It's just administrative. On paper." "On paper," Mark echoed, but his voice wasn't convincing, even to himself. I looked from one to the other, and I realized something else in the same instant. They'd already talked to a lawyer. They'd already planned the steps. This wasn't a discussion. This was the last part of their plan where they needed my signature. My throat tightened. I thought about my own student loans, my tiny savings account, my life that barely felt stable on a good month. I thought about strangers showing up at the door, about phone calls that didn't stop, about being trapped in something I never agreed to. Why me? I asked, even though I already knew. Claire reached across the table and touched my hand, soft and careful. Because you're family. But the way she said it didn't sound like love. It sounded like leverage. Mark's phone buzzed on the table, and when he glanced at the screen, the color drained from his face. He turned it slightly away from me, but I saw enough: unknown number, missed call, and then another immediately after. He muted it, jaw clenched. Claire noticed too. Her eyes flicked toward the front window like she expected somebody to be standing outside. Then she looked back at me and her voice took on that sweet tone again, the one she used when she wanted something. We can't ignore this. Dad left us a fire. We just need you to hold the bucket for a minute while we figure out how to put it out. I stared at the stacks of paper and felt a weird calm slide in, like my body had decided panic wasn't useful yet. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just nodded once, slow, pretending I needed time. Because if they wanted me to hold the bucket, I needed to know exactly what they were trying to pour into it. That evening, the house felt different. The same furniture, the same framed family photos, the same faint smell of my father's cologne lingering in the hallway, yet everything seemed staged, like a set built to convince me we were still the kind of family that protected each other. Claire stayed after Mark left, to keep me company, she said. She made tea, the herbal kind my father hated, and placed it in front of me like a peace offering. We sat in the living room while the TV stayed off and the silence kept trying to become a conversation. I know this is a lot, she started. I didn't answer. I watched her hands instead, how she wrapped them around the mug, how she kept her nails perfect even in the middle of a crisis. Claire had always been good at looking put together when things were falling apart. Growing up, she'd be the one to smooth over fights, rewrite stories, make our messes sound smaller than they were. I used to admire her for it. Now it made my skin crawl. We just need you to understand, she continued, voice gentle. This isn't forever. I'm trying to understand how you decided it would be me, I said. She blinked, like I'd said something rude. It's not like we decided. Yes, it is. She sighed, set her mug down, and leaned forward as if that posture made her more sincere. You're the least complicated option. There it was. Not my name. Not a direct statement. Just the math of it. I was the variable they could move without messing up their own equation. I stood up and walked to the window, mostly so she wouldn't see my face. Outside, the streetlight flickered, and a car passed too slowly. The little paranoid part of me wondered if it was someone watching. I hated that thought, hated that my brain was already shifting into survival mode. Mark has a business, Claire said behind me, like she was giving a presentation. If his accounts get flagged, he's done. I have a house, a kid, and a mortgage. If anything hits my credit, I could lose everything. You're younger. You can bounce back. I turned around. So I'm the crash pad. Her mouth tightened. That's not fair. No, it's not, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. And you know what else isn't fair? Acting like Dad's mess is some group project and you're assigning me the hardest part. Claire's eyes flashed, and for a second her calm mask slipped. Do you think I want this? Do you think any of us want this? I almost said yes, because part of me did think that. Not that they wanted my father dead, but that they wanted someone else to suffer the consequences. Then her phone buzzed, and she flinched. Actually flinched. She glanced at the screen and didn't pick up. What is it? I asked. Nothing, she lied. The phone buzzed again. She grabbed it and walked toward the kitchen, speaking in a low voice I couldn't hear. I stayed in the living room, staring at the family photos, us at a beach when I was 12, my father's arm around Claire, his smile big and proud. Mark holding a trophy. Me awkwardly in the corner, squinting in the sun. We looked like a normal family. That's what everyone at the funeral cried for. The version of us that looked good in frames. When Claire came back, her face was pale. She tried to hide it, but she couldn't hide the way her hands shook when she set her phone down. "We don't have time," she said, dropping the sweet voice. "We need to move fast." "There it is," I said quietly. "That's why you're pushing. Because someone's pressuring you." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't understand what this can turn into." "I'm starting to," I answered. She opened her mouth to respond, but a loud knock hit the front door, 3 hard raps that didn't sound like a neighbor. Claire froze. I froze. The knock came again, louder, impatient. Claire whispered, "Don't open it." I didn't move. My heartbeat thudded in my ears while the house held its breath. After a moment, whoever was outside stopped knocking. I heard footsteps on the porch, then the faint scrape of something being slid through the mail slot. Claire rushed to the door, snatched the paper off the floor, and crumpled it in her fist before I could read it. That alone told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just a paper problem. "Give it to me," I said. "No. Claire." She stared at me, eyes wet but not with grief. With fear. With anger. With something close to resentment, like my refusal to cooperate was a personal betrayal. "You're acting like I'm the enemy," she said. "I'm acting like you're not telling me the truth," I replied. "Because you're not." She swallowed hard, then finally unfolded the paper. The handwriting was bold and messy, not official at all. It listed a number, a deadline, and a sentence that made my stomach twist. "Pay by Friday. No excuses." Claire grabbed it back and tucked it under a stack of mail, like hiding it would erase it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Something in me clicked into place, cold, clear, almost calm. If my family had already chosen me as their shield, I had to stop reacting like the youngest daughter who needed protecting. I had to become the person who protected herself. That night, when I went up to my old bedroom, I didn't fall into bed. I sat on the floor and replayed the last 2 days like security footage. The hugs. The careful words. The way everyone kept saying "we" while moving me toward the edge of the cliff. And that's when I realized the most dangerous part of their plan. They truly believed I didn't know anything about my father beyond the funeral speeches. They believed I was easy to guide, easy to guilt, easy to scare into signing. They had no idea there was one thing my father had made sure I remembered. A place. A box. And an envelope he told me never to mention. I didn't sleep. I just sat there on the carpet, back against my bed, staring at the dark shape of my father's study door across the hall. The house had that late-night creaking sound, like it was stretching its bones. Every now and then a car passed outside and the headlights slid across the ceiling, and I kept thinking the same thing: they're rushing me because they're scared, not because they care. When the sky started turning that weak gray-blue, I got up and moved through the hallway like I was breaking into my own life. The study door was locked, like always. That used to feel normal. Now it felt like a challenge. I went to the kitchen drawer where my dad kept random keys, old batteries, and junk mail clips. I didn't even dig around much. I already knew which key it was because he'd made me fetch it once years ago, when he lost his temper looking for the spare. The lock clicked on the first try. The sound made my stomach flip. His study smelled like paper and dust and that faint smoky scent from the little candle warmer he used in winter. I stood there for a second, letting myself feel it. This was his space. His secrets lived here. And even though he was gone, it still felt like he could walk in and ask what I was doing. I went straight to the bookshelf on the left wall, the one filled with old hardcovers and those business biographies he liked to pretend he read. Behind the third row, there was a false backing, something he'd shown me once with this strange, serious look on his face. I slid my hand back there and found the edge of a thin wooden panel. It came loose with a quiet scrape, and my heart started pounding harder, like my body finally understood this was real. The box was there, just like I remembered. Small, dark, almost plain. Inside were boring things at first: tax folders, a life insurance pamphlet, some notes in his handwriting that didn't mean anything to me. Then, under all of it, was the envelope. Yellowed, sealed, heavier than it looked. My name was written on the front in his messy, rushed pen, like he'd written it while someone was calling him from another room. I sat in his desk chair to open it. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press the envelope against the desk to tear it clean. The papers inside weren't sentimental. No last letter about how proud he was. No apology. Just legal language and signatures and stamped pages that made my eyes burn from trying to focus. It was a trust. A separate one. Not part of what Claire and Mark were sorting. It listed assets I didn't know existed and an attorney's office in the city, along with instructions that sounded like they were built to survive exactly what was happening now. My dad's name was there, and below it, mine. Sole beneficiary. Not shared. Not to be divided equally. Just me. I read it twice before it fully landed, like my brain needed time to accept the shape of it. He knew. He'd known he was building a mess. He'd known the people around him, maybe even his own family, would scramble and point fingers when it all exploded. And in the middle of all that, he'd drawn a line around me in ink. My first emotion wasn't relief. It was anger. The kind that feels hot and personal. Because if he could plan this, he could have told me more. He could have warned me. He could have protected us in a way that didn't involve me sitting up all night fearing strangers at the door. But then I looked at the date on the document. Years ago. Before things got worse. Before the late-night calls became more frequent. Before he started snapping at little questions. I folded the papers back into the envelope and stared at the desk. For a second I imagined him sitting here, signing this with that tight look in his eyes, trying to do the one decent thing he could do without admitting he was drowning. It wasn't love the way people describe it in movies. It was love with fear in it. Messy love. But still, it was something. I slid the envelope into my bag and locked the study door behind me. Then I stood in the hallway and listened. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet right before somebody makes a move. When Claire texted me later, meeting at noon. Don't be late. I stared at the screen and almost laughed. She had no idea she'd already lost the moment she decided I was the easiest target. By noon, they were back at the dining table like it was their stage. Mark's laptop was open. Claire had 2 neat stacks of paper and a pen placed right on top, ready for me like a trap dressed up as organization. My Uncle Richard was there too, sitting slightly off to the side, acting like he was just support, but watching everything like a referee who already picked a team. Claire smiled when I walked in, too bright, too controlled. "Hey," she said, soft voice. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," I said, and sat down without waiting for an invitation. Mark didn't waste time. He started talking like he'd been practicing in the car. We spoke with a lawyer. This is the cleanest way. You sign as the temporary point person, and we negotiate down the amounts. We can refinance certain portions. It'll buy us time. Claire slid the papers toward me slowly. "It doesn't mean you pay it," she said. "It just means you're the contact, the responsible party while we sort the estate." Uncle Richard jumped in with a concerned face. "Sweetheart, your dad would have wanted the family protected. You're strong. You'll get through this. I looked at the paperwork without touching it. The language was heavy, official. It used words like assume, liable, guarantor. Not a single sentence looked temporary. Not a single page looked like a simple favor. I'm not signing this, I said. The room went still. Claire's smile flickered like a light bulb about to die. Mark's jaw tightened. Uncle Richard leaned back, like I'd just broken the script. Claire tried again, softer, like she was talking to a stubborn puppy. Please don't do this right now. We're all under pressure. I know, I said, keeping my voice calm on purpose. That's exactly why I'm not signing. Mark pushed his chair back slightly. Do you understand what happens if nobody signs? I understand what happens if I do, I replied. Claire's eyes sharpened. So what, you're just going to abandon us? There it was. The guilt weapon. The word family use like a knife. I reached into my bag and pulled out my envelope. I didn't slam it down. I placed it on the table gently, right between her stacks of paper, like I was setting a glass down at a restaurant. What's that? Mark asked. Claire's face changed first. Not because she knew what it was. Because she sensed it wasn't good for her. I slid the documents out and turned the first page so they could read it. The trust title. The date. My father's name. The attorney's name. And my name listed where theirs weren't. Mark leaned forward. His eyes moved fast, like he was trying to find a loophole by force. Uncle Richard's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Claire didn't move for a second, like her body stalled. You knew about this, she said. Voice thin. I found it, I replied. In Dad's study. Mark looked up, sharp and angry. Why didn't you tell us? I almost said because you didn't tell me about the millions, did you? But I didn't. I didn't want to scream. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of calling me emotional. I just kept my tone flat. Because you didn't include me in anything until you needed my signature, I said. You weren't trying to protect me. You were trying to use me. Uncle Richard cleared his throat. This doesn't change the debts. It changes my position, I said. Claire's eyes flashed. So you'll take money Dad hid and leave us with the mess. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something settle inside me like a final decision. Dad didn't hide this from me. He hid it from you. Mark rubbed his face with both hands, then dropped them hard onto the table. Okay. Fine. But the creditors. I'm not the estate, I said. And I'm not your shield. Claire leaned in, voice tight. We can still work together if you just. No, I cut in, still calm. I'll work with a lawyer. You can work with yours. But I'm not taking responsibility for debt I didn't create. Mark stared at the papers again, then back at me, like he couldn't believe the ground had shifted under him. Claire's hands clenched around her pen so hard her knuckles went pale. Uncle Richard sighed like he was disappointed in me. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I met his eyes. I think you made it hard when you decided the youngest one should carry the worst part. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence felt thick, like the air before a storm. Then Mark's phone buzzed again, and this time he didn't ignore it. He glanced at the screen, and his face went tight with panic. They're calling again, he said quietly. Claire swallowed. Tell them we're handling it. Mark looked at me like he wanted to blame me for the timing, like my refusal somehow created the problem. But the problem had been there the whole time. I was just no longer the solution they could force. I stood up, gathered my papers, and slid them back into my bag. I'm leaving, I said. If you want to talk like adults later, we can. But I'm done being cornered. Claire's voice rose, sharp now. You're really going to do this to us? I paused at the doorway and looked back. You did it to me first. I didn't go far. I drove to a small coffee place a few blocks away, the kind with scratched wooden tables and a line of regulars who always looked half awake. I sat in the corner with my phone in my hand, waiting for my hands to stop shaking. Only then did I realize I wasn't just scared. I was grieving in a way I hadn't been allowed to grieve yet. Not for my father's death exactly, but for the version of family I thought I had. I called the attorney listed on the trust document. A receptionist answered like it was just another weekday, and I had to swallow hard before I could say my father's name without my voice cracking. They scheduled me for the next morning. The calm professionalism of it all was strangely comforting. It made everything feel less like chaos and more like a process I could survive. Over the next few days, the house turned into a war zone without shouting. Messages came from Claire that swung between sweet and cruel depending on the hour. Mark sent short texts that sounded like he was trying to control his anger. Uncle Richard left me a voicemail full of disappointment and family values, as if values were something you used when convenient. And behind all of that, the pressure kept building. More missed calls. A strange car parked too long near the curb one afternoon. A knock at the door when I wasn't home, according to my neighbor. My lawyer explained things plainly. Debts didn't automatically become mine because I was the youngest. The estate had obligations. Not me. What Claire and Mark were pushing for was a shortcut that would protect them and expose me. Hearing it said out loud, by someone who had no emotional attachment to my last name, made something in me unclench. Claire tried to meet again. This time she showed up alone, wearing that same controlled look, but her eyes were tired. She sat across from me in the kitchen and spoke like she was trying to sound reasonable. If you have money set aside, she said, we can settle the worst lenders fast. Just to keep everyone safe. I stared at her and realized she still didn't get it. She was still thinking in terms of moving burdens around until they landed on someone else. Everyone's safe, I repeated. Or you safe? Her face tightened, and for a second she looked like she might cry. Then she got angry instead. You always make everything about you. That one stung because it was so unfair it almost made me laugh. I stood up and opened the front door. Not dramatically, not like a movie. Just a quiet boundary. You need to leave, I said. She walked out, and on the porch she turned back and said, Dad ruined us, and you're letting it happen. I didn't answer. I just watched her go. And when she drove away I realized something sad and simple. She wasn't mad that our father left debt. She was mad she couldn't hand it to me. Eventually the estate started selling things. The second car. Some investments. Pieces of my father's life turning into numbers in a spreadsheet. It was ugly and exhausting, but it was theirs to handle. They stopped calling me when they understood I wouldn't fold. The silence after that was strange, like the house finally exhaled. I didn't walk away feeling victorious. I walked away tired. But I also walked away clear. I learned that grief doesn't always bring people together. Sometimes it exposes what was already there, hiding under polite smiles. I learned that being the youngest in a family can mean being treated like the backup plan, the disposable one. And I learned that if you don't draw your own line, someone else will draw it for you, right across your life. I still miss my father in small, unexpected ways, catching a familiar scent in a hallway, hearing an old song on the radio, remembering how he took his coffee. But I don't miss the confusion. I don't miss feeling like I was always a step behind the truth. If he left me anything worth keeping, it wasn't just the trust. It was the final permission to stop shrinking myself for people who only loved me when I was useful. And maybe that's the part nobody talks about at funerals, Sometimes the real inheritance is the moment you finally choose yourself, even when your own family wants you to be their sacrifice.